What if I told you the moment the United Kingdom officially decided to strip Prince Harry and Meghan Markle of every royal title, privilege, courtesy, and connection wasn't born out of emotion, scandal, or public pressure, but out of a single, chilling question raised in the halls of Parliament? At what point does a royal stop being royal? Think about that for a moment. Think about how heavy, how loaded, how historically dangerous that question is. And then imagine the air in the House of Commons thickening, tightening, constricting, as every person in that room, from lifelong monarchists to hardened Republicans, realized that the question wasn't theoretical anymore. It was about Harry. It was about Meghan. And it was about consequences that could no longer be ignored. The question wasn't just provocative. It wasn't just political. It was a line in the sand. And once that line was drawn, nothing was ever going to be the same again. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because the truth is this: the stripping of royal titles has happened before in British history, but never like this. Never in the era of global media, social warfare, American celebrity culture, Netflix deals, best-selling memoirs, and explosive accusations flung across continents. Never had Parliament been forced to step in, to intervene, to act as the final judge on what it means to be a royal in the 21st century. And never before had a Duke of the realm, the son of a reigning monarch, been the subject of such an extreme, unprecedented political action. And that is exactly where this story begins, with a sense of disbelief so loud it echoed through the country. People woke up to headlines they weren't sure were real. Parliament to vote on stripping titles. Privileges of the Sussexes under review. Historic motion filed in Westminster. And mixed inside the shock was a question people whispered to one another in cafes, in workplaces, in online debates that turned vicious within minutes. Are Harry and Meghan really about to lose everything? The public didn't have the answer. The palace refused to comment. But Parliament knew something the public didn't. Ask yourself this: how does a situation escalate to the point where lawmakers, not monarchs, decide the fate of a prince? How does a centuries-old tradition collide so violently with modern political responsibility that national identity, constitutional duty, and royal loyalty all fuse into a single explosive debate? And more importantly, why did it happen now? Why this moment, after years of tension, interviews, exposés, controversies, accusations, and fractured relationships? What exactly pushed the situation from simmering distrust into full-blown crisis? As you'll soon discover, the story didn't simply begin with the vote. It began long before that. In private conversations, secret briefings, leaked documents, rising public frustration, and one uncomfortable truth: the monarchy's patience had not just worn thin, it had snapped. But let's be honest. Whether you support the Sussexes, dislike them, sympathize with them, or simply find them exhausting, you cannot deny their impact. Their every move sends shockwaves. Their every statement becomes a debate. Their every claim turns into headlines that outrun the news cycle. And whether intentionally or indirectly, they've placed the royal family in situations no modern monarchy has ever faced. That's why this moment, Parliament stepping forward to decide their future, wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. And it definitely wasn't sudden. What you're about to discover is that the storm brewing behind the scenes was far bigger than anyone knew. Far darker, far more complex, and far more dangerous than a simple title removal narrative. This was about power, identity, citizenship, loyalty, constitution, and a question Britain had been avoiding for years. What do you do when two of the world's most famous royals no longer fit the definition of royalty? Picture this. The lights inside Westminster are harsh, white, almost sterile. The conversations are muted, sharp, clipped. Ministers move quickly, papers tucked under arms, phones buzzing like angry insects. Somewhere in the building, a committee room door closes quietly. Too quietly. The kind of quiet that signals something serious, something secret, something volatile. And inside that room, a file sits on the table. A thick file, cream-colored, marked with a red strip of warning tape. And written across the front, in perfectly neat black lettering, are three words that will make sense later in this story: Sussex Title Review. This moment didn't happen randomly. This file didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the result of months, and in some ways, years, of internal government concern. Concerns about diplomatic confusion with foreign governments. Concerns about public anger. Concerns about what happens when royalty crosses into political activism, media warfare, and international legal territory. Concerns, above all, about precedent. Because if a prince could publicly break, distance, contradict, and challenge the institution he belonged to, at what point was he still a prince? And that's the question no one wanted to answer, until Parliament decided it had no choice. The build-up to this was not a single moment, but a chain reaction. A timeline of fractures that widened into cracks, cracks that widened into splits, and splits that eventually stretched into a constitutional earthquake. But here's the twist. Most people didn't see it coming. Not because the tension wasn't obvious, but because the idea of Parliament revoking titles from a royal felt impossible. Absurd. Out of bounds. Something that simply didn't happen in modern Britain. Something that belonged in history books, not present-day news alerts. And yet, that is exactly what was unfolding, slowly at first, then rapidly, then violently. Imagine a political domino effect where every decision triggered another, every concern escalated another, every leaked remark ignited another. And soon, lawmakers realized they weren't dealing with a royal issue. They were dealing with a national issue. Now think about how the public responded. Think about the raw emotion people have when it comes to the monarchy. Pride, nostalgia, anger, indifference, loyalty, resentment, fascination. The monarchy is not just a family. It is a symbol, a brand, a political entity, a cultural anchor. And the moment Parliament stepped into royal territory, ordinary people felt something shift, something dramatic. Suddenly, this wasn't about Harry and Meghan's personal choices. It wasn't about interviews or memoirs or California or family drama. It was about what the United Kingdom itself believed the monarchy should represent. And when public frustration met political responsibility, the pressure became unbearable. But here's the real shocker, the twist you're not expecting yet. Public pressure wasn't the main reason Parliament acted. It wasn't even the loudest reason. The louder reason came from somewhere far more powerful, international diplomacy. Because foreign governments were confused, deeply confused, about how to address Harry and Meghan, how to categorize them, what their titles meant legally, and what role they still played. And those diplomatic confusions built into diplomatic complaints. Complaints that flowed back to the UK government. Complaints that demanded clarity. Complaints that forced Parliament to confront the truth. The titles, as they existed, were no longer functional. They were liabilities. So now ask yourself, what happens when titles become diplomatic problems? What happens when privileges assigned by birth become complications in global politics? What happens when the monarchy's internal drama spills into state matters that foreign governments demand answers for? That's when Parliament steps in. That's when tradition meets law. That's when emotion meets constitution. And that's when royalty meets reality. But before the world could process any of this, before headlines began screaming, before pundits began arguing, before the palace even crafted its first controlled, measured statement, something else happened. Something unexpected. Something that would push Parliament from discussion into action. Something that would transform whispers into decisions and concerns into consequences. Something that, and I promise you, changed the tone of this entire crisis overnight. And that moment began with a single sentence spoken behind closed doors. A sentence that would ignite everything that came next. A sentence no one expected. A sentence that marked the point of no return. The sentence was simple, unadorned, delivered without theatrics, without anger, without hesitation. But it carried the weight of 3 centuries of constitutional history behind it. A senior parliamentary official leaned forward, placed both hands flat on the polished table, and said quietly, "The monarchy cannot afford ambiguity any longer." That was it. 11 words. 11 words that slammed through the room like a thunderclap. 11 words that immediately changed the tone, the atmosphere, the posture of every person present. Because ambiguity is survivable for politics, for tabloids, for celebrity PR, but ambiguity is lethal for monarchy. Royalty depends on clarity. Who is in, who is out, who represents, who embodies, who carries the institution's authority. And in that moment, the truth became unavoidable. Harry and Meghan existed in a space monarchy was never designed to handle. A space where a royal can simultaneously step away but still wield royal influence, reject duty but retain royal titles, criticize the institution but benefit from the prestige of association. That contradiction had become too large to ignore, too confusing to manage, too costly to maintain. And this is where the story gets even more intense, because once those words were spoken, the conversation shifted instantly from, "Should we discuss this?" to "What must we do?" Imagine a committee of political strategists, legal scholars, constitutional experts, and senior MPs suddenly realizing they were no longer discussing personalities. They were discussing precedent. And precedent is everything in British constitutional life. Precedent becomes law. Precedent becomes expectation. Precedent becomes the template for future crises. If Parliament allowed this situation to continue unresolved, it would set a standard that any future royal could repeat. And that terrified them, not because of Harry and Meghan as individuals, but because of what their situation represented: a modern monarchy colliding with modern media, modern identity politics, modern global influence, modern commercial power. A monarchy that could no longer control the narrative around its own members. The build-up to this crisis wasn't explosive at first. It was quiet, subtle, like a drip of water wearing down stone. A late-night briefing here, a concerned phone call there, a diplomatic note arriving from a foreign government asking which titles should be used for official correspondence. Another nation questioning whether the Duke of Sussex represented the crown or not. Agencies within the UK government unsure how to categorize the couple in state documents. Each problem small, each problem solvable, but together they formed a pattern, one that government officials could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Now think about how you would feel sitting in Parliament, knowing that every move, every word, every decision could become global news within minutes. Think about the pressure, the fear of miscommunication, the fear of appearing disrespectful to the monarchy, the fear of appearing weak to the public, the fear of escalating an already volatile situation. That's the reality lawmakers faced. Royal watchers were yelling from one side. Anti-monarchists were yelling from the other. International observers were taking notes. And at the center of the storm stood two people who were thousands of miles away, living a life the monarchy could not control, predict, or influence. This is why the tension inside Westminster grew so rapidly. Government was forced into a position it never wanted, deciding what to do about royals who existed outside the boundaries of royal tradition. It wasn't a personal dispute. It was a constitutional paradox. And paradoxes are dangerous. They destabilize. They expose fractures. They demand solutions that history has not prepared you for. But while Parliament was struggling with legal definitions and political implications, the public was wrestling with emotion. By the time the crisis peaked, you had people furious, people heartbroken, people mocking, people defending, people confused, people utterly exhausted. Social media was a battlefield. Comment sections were war zones. Talk shows became arenas for outrage. You couldn't stand in a grocery store without overhearing arguments about whether Harry and Meghan had betrayed the monarchy or whether the monarchy had betrayed them. And all of this, all the noise, all the chaos, all the emotion, weighed down on Parliament like a tidal wave. Yet here's the twist. Inside Westminster, the public outcry wasn't the tipping point. It was merely the echo. The real tipping point came from a place most people never consider: national security. Because as strange as it sounds, royal titles, even ceremonial ones, create diplomatic and security complexities. They open doors. They influence perception. They affect protocol. And when someone holding such titles lives outside the country, engages in unpredictable media ventures, and becomes a polarizing global figure, that creates vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that intelligence agencies quietly flagged. Vulnerabilities that foreign allies quietly questioned. Vulnerabilities that forced parliamentary committees to take the issue far more seriously than the public realized. The emotional question was simple: should they keep their titles? The constitutional question was more complicated: can they? The diplomatic question was worse: what message does it send if they do? The security question was the one that froze everyone. What is the risk if they don't? Suddenly, it wasn't about drama. It wasn't about interviews. It wasn't about celebrity deals or family disagreements. It was about duty, responsibility, public trust, international clarity, legal consistency. And when duty collides with identity, when responsibility collides with reputation, and when tradition collides with modern reality, something has to give. And that's when the final warning came in. Late at night, unscheduled, unplanned, urgent. A senior government advisor walked into a private parliamentary office carrying a sealed envelope. No assistants, no staff, no explanation. He placed the envelope on the desk, looked at the MP across from him, and said quietly, "You need to read this." In full. Immediately. Then he walked out without another word. Inside the envelope was a document that would change the course of this entire story. A document that would force Parliament to accelerate everything, to escalate the crisis to its highest level, to move from discussion to action with shocking speed. And when that document was read, when its contents were understood, when its implications were realized, that was the moment lawmakers knew there was no turning back. The document inside that envelope wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't written in emotional language or political rhetoric. It wasn't even labeled in a way that suggested urgency. It was clinical, technical, almost cold, yet its impact was nuclear. It laid out, point by point, the legal, diplomatic, and constitutional contradictions created by allowing Harry and Meghan to retain royal titles while holding no royal role, bearing no royal duty, and operating entirely outside the established framework of the monarchy. And buried inside the paragraphs, between legal definitions, cross-reference statutes, and procedural footnotes, was the line that froze Parliament in its tracks. Failure to clarify the status of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex may result in constitutional uncertainty and diplomatic misalignment with allied nations. Constitutional uncertainty, diplomatic misalignment. Those phrases aren't casual. They're not used lightly. They signal national-level consequences, the kind that governments cannot ignore, postpone, or wish away. This is the moment everything shifted. Until then, the conversation had been tense, complicated, emotionally charged, but still manageable. The kind of issue Parliament could debate slowly, carefully, strategically. But once the document raised the possibility of constitutional instability, the clock began ticking. You could almost feel the urgency radiating off the page, thick and heavy, like heat rising from asphalt. Parliamentary officials suddenly moved faster. Meetings were rescheduled. Committees were reorganized. Advisors were summoned. The tone shifted from "should we" to "we must." And in that instant, the story of Harry and Meghan losing their titles was no longer a theory or an exaggeration or a media fantasy. It was a matter of national governance. It had crossed the line from personal to political, from controversial to unavoidable. But the part most people don't realize is this. Inside Parliament, there wasn't complete agreement on how to proceed. Some believed stripping titles was too extreme, too punitive, too risky. Others argued it was the only logical step left. Others still wondered whether Britain was ready for the backlash, the international noise, the legal pushback, the political fallout. And while this debate raged inside government buildings, thousands of miles away, Harry and Meghan continued their daily lives, unaware that their titles and the privileges attached to them were being dissected at the highest levels of power. That contrast was surreal. A couple living a seemingly glamorous California lifestyle, and on the other side of the world, their royal identities being weighed like items on a scale. Ask yourself something. How must it feel to be the subject of government deliberations without even being in the room? To know decisions made by people you've never met could redefine your identity permanently? To have your future discussed not by family members, but by lawmakers who are bound not by emotions, but by statute? And how must it feel to have your past, your choices, your interviews, your statements, your alliances all rolled into a single question? Are you still a royal or not? Once upon a time, such questions were decided quietly, behind palace walls, by monarchs who ruled with tradition and discretion. But now, in a modern constitutional monarchy, these decisions were in the hands of Parliament, a body driven by law, politics, pressure, and responsibility to the public, not personal sentiment. That's what made this moment so historic. The stripping of royal titles has happened before, but almost always through palace procedures, royal decrees, or family negotiations. Never in this century had Parliament itself prepared to take the lead in such a dramatic intervention. It wasn't just a legal action. It was a symbolic one. A statement that the monarchy, while ancient, was still bound to the nation's governance and not immune from accountability. And for many MPs, that was the key point. If titles create complications for the country, then the country, through Parliament, has the right to resolve them, even if the titles belong to a prince. This is where the intensity of the moment reaches its peak, because once Parliament moved into action, everything began unfolding with astonishing speed. Committees drafted motions. Advisors edited language. Legal teams ensured compliance with constitutional requirements. The Speaker reviewed procedural structure. And through all of this, one question pulsed beneath every conversation like a thudding heartbeat. Would the monarchy support this? Not publicly, of course. Monarchs remain neutral. But privately, quietly, subtly, the truth is, Parliament would not have moved forward if it sensed full resistance from the royal household. That's the unspoken reality of constitutional monarchy. Parliament may act independently, but major actions involving royal identity often mirror quiet palace sentiment. So yes, whether spoken or unspoken, there was a sense that the monarchy itself was ready for clarity, ready for a boundary, ready for a line drawn at last. And although no public statement had been made, although no royal had uttered a word, the silence itself was revealing. Because in politics, silence is rarely accidental. Silence is alignment. Silence is permission. And that's when everything accelerated. And that's when everything changed. Because the moment Parliament decided to move the process forward, something else happened. Something that took this entire crisis from dramatic to explosive. A leak. Not from a journalist. Not from a staffer looking for attention. But from someone inside the political machine who understood the magnitude of what was coming and knew it could not stay hidden forever. Late one night, a major news outlet received an anonymous tip. Parliament preparing vote to strip Prince and Duchess of Sussex of all titles and privileges. No details, no documents, no names, just one sentence. But it was enough. Enough to unleash a media firestorm. Enough to ignite debates across the country. Enough to trigger frenzy across social media. Enough to drag the palace into an uncomfortable spotlight. Enough to force Parliament to respond publicly sooner than it planned. And suddenly, the story wasn't just moving, it was running. Headlines erupted. Commentators clashed. Supporters and critics launched into digital war. International media circled like predators sensing blood. And for the first time, the world realized that this wasn't rumor. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't hyperbole. It was real. It was happening. And it was happening fast. But the biggest twist, the one that set the tone for everything that followed, didn't come from Parliament. It didn't come from the palace. It didn't come from the media, or the public, or even Harry and Meghan themselves. It came from a single senior MP, standing in a crowded hallway outside the Commons chamber, who turned to the cameras with a stark statement that rewrote the narrative instantly. This is not about punishment. This is about protecting the institution. And with that one sentence, the story transformed from drama into history. What if I told you that the moment the motion was introduced, the exact second those words first echoed across the chamber floor, Westminster didn't feel like a political arena anymore. It felt like a courtroom, a battleground, a historical stage where every breath held weight, every silence carried tension, and every glance between MPs revealed a truth no one dared to say aloud. The monarchy wasn't just being questioned, it was being put on trial. And the verdict, whatever it would become, was about to shake the foundations of royal identity in a way Britain had never seen in modern times. So let me take you inside that room, inside that moment, inside the shock that spread like electricity through every corner of Parliament. Because the atmosphere didn't crackle, it detonated. The introduction of the motion didn't come with shouting. It didn't come with performative theatrics. It came with something far more unnerving, precision. The MP who rose to speak didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. Authority doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it emerges in carefully measured tone, tightly controlled breath, and words chosen like weapons. Mr. Speaker, they began, I rise today to introduce a motion addressing an urgent constitutional matter concerning the titles and privileges held by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The moment the words, urgent constitutional matter, rang out, heads lifted. Pens paused. Conversations froze. Because that phrase isn't used lightly. It signals a matter that cannot wait, cannot be ignored, and cannot be softened. Imagine the camera sweeping across the Commons. Some MPs stiffened instantly, like statues. Others turned slowly, cautiously, as though afraid they had misheard. A few exchanged knowing looks, the kind of look that said, "So it's happening." Some looked almost relieved. Others looked terrified. Why? Because everyone in that room understood that a motion like this wasn't merely symbolic. It wasn't a political gambit. It wasn't a statement of opinion. It was a declaration, a formal, legal declaration, that Parliament was prepared to step into royal territory in a way that would reverberate around the world. Now ask yourself, how does it feel to witness history in real time? How does your stomach drop when you realize the country is about to cross a line it never thought it would approach? How do you keep your composure when the future of the monarchy, the very institution that anchors Britain's identity, is suddenly on the table? That's what the MPs felt in that moment. A sense of gravity so thick it pressed down on the room like fog. You didn't have to hear their heartbeats to know they were pounding. You didn't have to see their thoughts to know they were racing. Because this wasn't just another debate. This was a constitutional reckoning decades in the making. The MP presenting the motion continued, laying out the rationale with a calmness that wasn't calm at all. It was controlled fire. Every line pierced deeper. The United Kingdom must preserve clarity in matters of representation. Titles carry weight in international affairs. Ambiguity undermines the stability of the crown. The public deserves consistency in the responsibilities associated with royal status. Each argument was a brick, and with every brick, the wall around Harry and Meghan's titles began to shrink. And the most shocking part? The MP wasn't using emotional language. They were using logic. That was the real danger. Logic leaves no space to escape. In the viewing galleries above, journalists stopped typing and leaned forward. Visitors held their breath. Staff members near the door stood frozen in their tracks. Because everyone understood instinctively. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a decision. The motion wasn't asking permission. It was asserting authority. It wasn't suggesting action. It was demanding it. Then came the moment that truly rattled the Commons. The MP paused, placed the motion on the desk before them, and said, "This proposal reflects months of consultation with constitutional experts, diplomatic advisors, and government officials concerned with the stability of the crown." That single sentence detonated across the chamber. Months of consultation? That meant this wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't reactive. This wasn't fueled by headlines, or interviews, or public outrage. This was planned, prepared, coordinated. That revelation alone shifted the entire energy of the room. Some MPs looked blindsided, their faces tightening as they realized discussions had been happening without their knowledge. Others nodded slowly, as though they had seen this coming for a long time. A few visibly panicked, recognizing the political implications. Because if this motion had been building quietly for months, then it meant the decision to introduce it was not a reaction, it was an inevitability. Now imagine the speaker's expression. Neutral, yet alert. Calm, yet focused. The kind of expression a referee wears when they know the match is about to turn violent. The speaker's gavel tapped lightly. Not to silence chaos, but to signal gravity. "The motion is acknowledged," they said. "Proceed." And with that single word, the trajectory of the monarchy shifted. Because until that moment, everything was theoretical. But now the motion was officially on the parliamentary record, a living document, a legal spark, a fuse lit. The speeches began. Slowly at first, cautious, measured, almost clinical. MPs who supported the motion stood to speak, and their arguments were stark. One cited the diplomatic confusion caused by mixed title usage abroad. Another referenced the constitutional inconsistencies created by a royal who simultaneously rejects and retains royal status. A third pointed to public frustration reaching unprecedented levels. Their tone wasn't hostile. It was weary, like people exhausted from years of tension finally stepping into a moment of decision they had hoped to avoid. Opposition MPs rose as well, their voices sharper and more emotional. "Are we prepared for the consequences?" one asked. "Is this the message we want to send to the world?" another demanded. A third warned that revoking royal titles could fracture the country further. Their arguments carried sincerity, perhaps even desperation, but they shared one thing in common. None of them denied the issue existed. Even critics of the motion acknowledged the paradox. They simply feared the fallout. And that's what made the debate so surreal. It wasn't a clash between belief and disbelief. It was a clash between caution and conviction, between fear of backlash and fear of instability, between holding on to tradition and confronting modern reality. But while the debate grew heated, while emotions rose, while the chamber pulsed with tension, something unexpected happened. Something subtle, something easy to miss unless you were watching closely. As the hours passed, the motion's support began growing. Not with loud declarations, but with silent shifts. MPs who had walked in undecided suddenly leaned forward in interest. Others scribbled notes rapidly. Some whispered urgently to colleagues. The temperature was changing. The room was tilting. The momentum was forming. And then, out of nowhere, everything changed. Because during a pause between speeches, a parliamentary aide entered the chamber through a side door, discreet but hurried, calm but visibly tense, and handed a sealed folder directly to the speaker. No explanation, no comment, just a folder. A folder that should not have arrived during open debate. A folder that instantly pulled every pair of eyes toward the speaker's desk. And in that moment, before anyone knew what was inside, before anyone understood what new information had just entered the room, the air in the Commons went still, because whatever message had arrived at that exact moment was about to change the debate, was about to change the motion, was about to change the future of the monarchy. What if the entire scandal, every headline, every meme, every furious Sussex phone call, could be traced back to one single voice in Australian politics? One politician who looked at the confidential information handed to them and made a split-second decision that would turn a quiet bureaucratic disagreement into a global spectacle? What if the entire world only found out that Harry and Meghan's private jet request had been denied because one elected official decided, "No, the public needs to hear this"? And what if that official wasn't acting out of malice, but out of something far more complicated? Principle, ego, political instinct, personal frustration, or maybe even the thrill of being the one who finally said out loud what others only whispered. Because here's the truth, the leak alone didn't ignite the wildfire. Leaks happen all the time. They simmer. They circulate. They die quietly when ignored. What turned this leak into a roaring global inferno was the moment it reached the desk, and then the mouth, of one of Australia's most outspoken political figures. A person notorious for speaking with blunt honesty, cutting commentary, and absolutely zero fear of backlash. A person who, depending on who you ask, is either a hero for transparency or a walking PR disaster. And when this politician opened the email containing the Sussex jet request and the government's refusal, they didn't see diplomacy. They didn't see privacy. They didn't see the need for restraint. They saw a story, a symbol, a perfect example, in their eyes, of the type of entitlement Australians have grown tired of. Imagine the moment. The politician sits at their desk, schemes the document, raises an eyebrow, and mutters something like, "You've got to be kidding." That immediate reaction, the disbelief, the irritation, the sense of déjà vu, wasn't about the Sussexes specifically. It was about the pattern. The rising tide of high-profile figures asking for exceptions, privileges, and taxpayer-funded perks at a time when ordinary citizens were being told to tighten their belts. You don't need insider sources to know the thought process. It was written all over their eventual public statement. This wasn't just personal frustration. It was political positioning. An opportunity to align themselves with the public's resentment toward double standards. But before this politician went public, they did something that reveals exactly how calculated the move was. They called two advisors. Both warned against speaking out. Both reminded them the Sussexes still had enormous global influence. Both cautioned that publicly criticizing a former senior royal could spark backlash, especially from British tabloids. But the politician didn't back down. In fact, the warnings seemed to strengthen their resolve. Because to them, this was bigger than Harry and Meghan. It was about drawing a line. And if they didn't draw it, Who would? So the next morning, during a routine press availability, not even a major event, just a small swarming of reporters outside Parliament House, the moment happened. A journalist asked a completely unrelated question about budget allocations. The politician answered. Then another reporter asked about celebrity expenditures. The politician responded. But then someone tossed a casual, almost playful query. Would the government ever fund a private jet for high-profile visitors like Prince Harry and Meghan Markle? No one expected the answer that followed. Not the reporters, not the staff, not the Australian government, and certainly not the Sussexes. The politician smirked slightly, the kind of smirk that tells you they've been waiting for this exact moment. And then they said it. The line that would be clipped, shared, memed, turned into headlines, and broadcast around the world within hours. If Harry and Meghan want to come to Australia, they can buy their own plane ticket like everyone else. And with that single sentence, sharp, dismissive, undeniable, the scandal snapped into focus. The politician didn't stop there. They went further, adding commentary about fairness, environmental responsibility, and the absurdity of expecting government-funded luxury after stepping away from royal duties. Every sentence was a blow. Every phrase landed with punchline precision. Every word fed the public's appetite for plain-spoken truth. The reporters erupted with questions. Cameras rolled. Microphones tilted forward. And the politician, now fully committed, doubled down. They spoke about protocol breaches, inappropriate expectations, and public accountability. They framed the Sussex request not as a misunderstanding, but as a symbol of the very attitude Australians reject. And here's where the emotional undercurrent kicks in. They weren't just chastising the Sussexes. They were affirming something deeply embedded in Australian identity, the belief that no one, not even royalty, floats above the public. It was the political equivalent of saying, "You're welcome here, but we're not rolling out a gold carpet." Within minutes, the quote hit social media. It spread first among Australian users. Then British royal watchers picked it up. Then American tabloids. Then global entertainment outlets. And each retelling sharpened the tone, amplified the phrasing, and made the politician's comment sound even more cutting than it originally was. But here's the twist. The politician didn't regret it. Not even as the clip racked up millions of views. Not even as royal reporters began calling their office in a frenzy. Not even as British commentators accused them of disrespecting the monarchy. They stood by their words. Proudly. And why? Because the politician understood something the Sussexes team underestimated. Public mood. When people are frustrated with their governments, when they are tired of elites, when they are struggling financially, they crave authenticity. They crave bluntness. They crave someone to say what everyone else is thinking. And in that moment, this Australian politician became the voice of a sentiment that had been building quietly for years. They didn't create the outrage, they unleashed it. Now imagine, for a moment, how this looked from the Sussex perspective. 1 minute, they were dealing with a logistical refusal, a private frustration, a disappointment, something that could have remained behind the scenes. The next minute, their names were plastered across international headlines with phrases like fuming, entitled, demanding, shamed, and told no. Their team scrambled. Their advisors warned the story was spiraling. Meghan reportedly felt blindsided. Harry reportedly felt humiliated. And both wondered, perhaps for the first time, whether their brand, so carefully crafted, so fiercely protected, was losing control. But here's where the emotional twist comes in. The politician wasn't done. They gave a radio interview the next day. And if you thought the first comment was bold, the next round made it look tame. They insisted that every visitor to Australia is treated with fairness and that no one should expect taxpayer-funded perks, especially those who've chosen private life over royal responsibility. They emphasized that environmental consistency mattered. They implied, subtly but unmistakably, that the Sussexes were out of touch. And then came the line that became even more viral than the original. If they're independent, then let them act independent. Independence isn't a title. It's a practice. That line hit harder than anyone expected. It echoed across continents. Commentators debated it. Activists applauded it. Critics condemned it. And through it all, the politician stood firm, unbothered by outrage, empowered by public praise. But here's the crucial part. That line is what convinced the Australian public that the government made the right decision. It framed the refusal not as a rejection of Harry and Meghan, but as a stance of national principle. And once the public sided with the politician, the Sussexes lost control of the narrative entirely. But here's where the deeper complexity lies. The politician didn't act alone. They weren't the original leaker. They weren't the architect of the controversy. They were simply the megaphone, the amplifier, the spark that reached the dry tinder at the perfect moment. But someone else, someone hidden, someone furious, someone inside the bureaucracy, handed them the match. And the question no one has fully answered is this. Why did that insider choose this politician? Why them? Why now? And what connection, if any, did they have to Kensington Palace or the Sussexes themselves? Because uncovering that answer. What if the most explosive reaction to Australia's refusal didn't come from the public, didn't come from Harry, didn't even come from Kensington Palace, but from Meghan herself? What if the moment that politicians quote hit the airwaves, buy your own plane ticket, triggered a chain reaction inside the Sussex team so intense, so emotional, so chaotic that staffers still talk about it in hushed tones? Because while the world was laughing, mocking, debating, and reposting memes, Meghan Markle wasn't scrolling through social media. She was pacing. She was furious. She was stunned. She was hurt. And above all, she was trying to make sense of something she never expected, being publicly dismissed by a government that once welcomed her like a superstar. Imagine the moment the news reached her. Not through a press release, not through a formal notice, but through a frantic message from an aide who had just seen the politician's viral clip. Meghan was reportedly in the middle of reviewing travel briefs, still hopeful the situation could be salvaged, still convinced the refusal was a misunderstanding. Then suddenly, boom, the clip arrives. A single sentence that transforms the mood instantly. A sentence that sounds more like a punchline than diplomacy. A sentence that strips away the facade of polite refusal and replaces it with public embarrassment. If they want to come, they can buy their own plane ticket. To Meghan, it wasn't just an insult. It was a humiliation. It was a message delivered not behind closed doors, but in front of cameras. It was a reminder that she no longer had the protection of royal machinery shielding her from public ridicule. She reportedly replayed the clip. Once, twice, 3 times. Each time her reaction deepened. From disbelief, to outrage, to a cold, sharp sense of betrayal. And here's where the emotional truth cuts deep. Meghan is used to criticism. She's endured tabloids, trolls, conspiracies, documentaries, and endless think pieces. But this was different. This wasn't a faceless commenter or an anonymous insider. This was a government official standing at a microphone, openly dismissing her in front of the world. And for a woman who built her brand on diplomacy, connection, and global humanitarianism, being treated like an entitled tourist stung in a way she wasn't prepared for. But her anger wasn't just about the remark. It was about the implications behind it. Meghan reportedly asked her team questions, rapid fire, her voice sharp with controlled intensity. Why would they say that publicly? Why would they embarrass us? Why wasn't this handled privately? Who leaked this? How did this get out? And the question beneath all the questions, the one she didn't say out loud, but everyone could feel, was simple. How did we lose control of this narrative? Because Meghan understood media better than anyone in the room. She knew how headlines form. She knew how stories metastasize. And she knew instantly that this wasn't a 3-hour story. This wasn't a blip. This wasn't a minor embarrassment that would quietly fade. This was the beginning of an international news cycle that would paint her and Harry as entitled, ungrateful, out of touch. She could see the narrative forming before the first article was written. She could see the tweets, the jokes, the op-eds, the panel debates. And she knew the damage this could do, not just to their reputations, but to the brand empire they had been meticulously constructing for years. Now let's add another layer. Meghan has always been someone who believes in solving problems through conversation, through strategy, through control. But how do you control a story that has already escaped into the wild? How do you manage an embarrassment that has crossed borders, sparked political commentary, and become a trending topic? Meghan reportedly tried to steady herself, instructing her team to gather every piece of information available, internal memos, emails, notes, timelines. She wanted a full picture. She wanted clarity. She wanted to know exactly how this happened. And as the pieces came together, one detail enraged her more than anything: the involvement of Kensington Palace. Because once Meghan learned that a palace email had been sent to Australia, an email Harry hadn't been warned about, an email that appeared to subtly guide protocol without the Sussexes' knowledge, something inside her snapped. To her, this wasn't just interference. It was sabotage. It was familiar. Too familiar. It reminded her of 2019, of 2020, of the months leading up to their departure from royal life. The briefings, the whispers, the unnamed palace sources that always seemed to know just enough to sway public opinion against her. And now, years later, it felt like the same machinery had quietly moved against them again. She allegedly said something to her team that summed up her entire emotional storm. They always find a way to undermine us. That's the emotional wound. That's the deeper ache beneath the anger. The belief, not unfounded, that forces within the institution still see them as a threat, that they are still being monitored, still being corrected, still being contained, still being punished for stepping outside the system. But the contradiction, the devastating irony, is that the palace didn't intend to sabotage them. The email was vague, subtle, arguably benign. But in Meghan's mind, intent didn't matter. Impact did. Perception did. And Meghan perceived this as yet another example of the rivalry between the two households, a rivalry that has shaped years of headlines. And when Meghan feels cornered, underestimated, or misrepresented, she goes into strategic mode. She tries to take back control. So she called her advisors. She called her PR representatives. She questioned whether a statement should be made. She explored whether the politician's remarks could be framed as inappropriate. She wondered whether to express disappointment publicly or whether to remain silent and let the story burn out. Her team, sensing the volatility of the moment, urged caution. They warned her that any public response would fuel the fire. They told her to wait. They told her to breathe. But Meghan reportedly hated the idea of waiting. She hated the idea of silence. Silence, in her experience, always allowed others to define the story. And yet, she didn't speak publicly. Not yet. She held back. She calculated. But that restraint didn't mean calm. Because behind the scenes, Meghan was directing her frustration in another direction, toward the Australian government. Especially after she learned that not only had a politician shamed them publicly, but an internal official had facilitated the leak in the first place. Meghan was furious that someone inside the government felt comfortable enough to leak sensitive correspondence. She reportedly viewed it as unprofessional, disrespectful, and unethical, and she wondered whether the leak itself was politically motivated, tied to anti-royal sentiment or Republican messaging. Now imagine the emotional storm in the room as Meghan processed all of this. Advisors trying to calm her, assistants updating her on the growing online reactions, security staff waiting quietly at the edges, Harry watching all of this with rising tension of his own. Because while Meghan's response was strategic fury, Harry's was something rawer, more painful, more explosive. But we'll get to him in the next chapter. For now, let's stay with Meghan. Because here's where the twist comes. After hours of internal debate, Meghan made a decision, one her team strongly advised against. She asked for a call to be arranged. A direct call. A call to Australia. Not for optics. Not for diplomacy. Not for negotiation. But because she believed she could salvage the situation personally. She believed that if she could speak directly to the right official, she could clarify the misunderstanding, soften the tone, and reset the dynamic. Meghan has always believed in the power of conversation. She believes she can change minds. She believes she can influence tone. And sometimes she's right. But this time she wasn't. Because that call, the one Meghan insisted on making, did not go the way she expected. The tone was cooler. The respect was present but distant. The answers were firm. The refusal was repeated. And for the first time in a long time, Meghan felt something she rarely experiences in diplomatic spaces: powerlessness. Once the call ended, stunned silence filled the room. But what she didn't know, not yet, was that this call would become the next leak. And that leak was far worse. Every movement in the chamber halted. Every whisper died instantly. Even the MPs who had been scribbling notes froze mid-sentence, their pens suspended in the air as though time itself had paused. Because sealed folders don't just appear in the middle of open debate. Not unless something urgent, sensitive, or explosive has just shifted the ground beneath Parliament's feet. The Speaker took the folder with that slow, deliberate caution used only when the stakes are sky-high. They didn't open it immediately. They didn't need to. The room already understood. Whatever was inside had the power to rewrite the trajectory of everything being discussed. The Speaker lowered their eyes to the document, slit open the seal, and began reading in silence. 10 seconds passed, then 15, then 20, and during those 20 seconds, the silence in the chamber became suffocating. MPs weren't just waiting, they were bracing. Because when the Speaker's face changes, the room reacts before words are even spoken. And the Speaker's expression did change. Subtly at first, a tightening of the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, then something sharper, something that looked like disbelief masked under parliamentary professionalism. Finally, the Speaker straightened, closed the folder, and cleared their throat. "Members of the House," they said, their voice steady but edged with gravity, "we have received new information relevant to the motion under discussion." A murmur rippled across the room. MPs leaned forward. Journalists in the gallery adjusted their cameras. Even the security guards shifted slightly, sensing the sudden spike in tension. The Speaker continued, "This document originates from the Cabinet Office. It outlines concerns raised within the last 48 hours regarding the legal and diplomatic ramifications of maintaining the current titles of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex." Another wave of murmurs. The phrase Cabinet Office struck hard, because that meant the highest levels of government were directly involved. Not advisors, not committees. The Cabinet Office. This wasn't just political anymore. This was structural, institutional, national. What if I told you the internal communication from Buckingham Palace, the one that arrived at the worst possible moment, the one whispered into the Speaker's ear like a secret too heavy for public air, wasn't sudden at all? What if I told you it was the final ripple of a hidden wave that had been quietly building for months behind closed doors, through secret briefings, private consultations, hushed conversations, and high-level meetings that not even senior MPs knew were taking place? Because the truth is this: Parliament may have shocked the world by introducing the motion publicly, but behind the scenes, the palace had already been bracing for impact. It wasn't just Parliament preparing to act. It was the monarchy itself preparing for something it hoped would never become necessary. Let's step backward for a moment. Not into the public narratives, not into the televised debates or the tabloid headlines or the polarized online noise, but into the private corridors of power, where decisions are not debated but forecasted, not shouted but whispered, not reacted to but quietly anticipated. Because long before the motion reached the floor of the House of Commons, long before journalists started crafting headline drafts, long before the public even sensed a shift, a handful of senior palace advisors had already seen the writing on the wall. They saw the rising diplomatic confusion. They saw the public frustration shifting into anger. They saw the government's subtle questions becoming less polite and more pressing. And most importantly, they saw something the public didn't: paperwork. Lots of it. Diplomatic paperwork, legal paperwork, parliamentary queries, foreign protocol inquiries, all circling around one central issue that the palace could no longer ignore. Inside the palace's private administrative wing, far beyond the public tours and glittering staterooms, there is a floor where the real machinery of monarchy operates. A place of quiet, efficiency, and strategy. A place where advisors don't react to crises, they anticipate them. And in that wing, tucked away in an office that most royal watchers don't even know exists, a series of classified briefings began taking place at the start of the year. These briefings weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. They were deeply uncomfortable. The first briefing was led by a senior constitutional advisor, a man who had worked with 3 monarchs and understood better than anyone how fragile public trust can become. He opened the meeting with a sentence that set the tone for everything that followed. "We have reached a point where the status quo is no longer sustainable." That statement didn't sit well. You could practically feel the discomfort radiate across the room. Because the palace doesn't like radical change. It doesn't like confrontation. It certainly doesn't like the idea of Parliament intervening in its affairs. But the advisor wasn't finished. "We cannot continue navigating ambiguity in matters of representation." It is creating strain within government departments and confusion abroad. Think about that for a moment. The monarchy, the institution known for its stability, its consistency, its predictability, now found itself at the center of confusion. That alone was deeply alarming. And the more the palace advisors reviewed the growing list of concerns, the clearer the pattern became. Diplomatic offices were requesting guidance on how to refer to the Sussexes. Protocol teams were unsure how to handle invitations, seating arrangements, formal references. Foreign governments were accidentally addressing Harry with titles he no longer used during official matters. And worst of all, some were using those titles intentionally, as leverage, to stir political friction or gain soft power influence. This was the palace's nightmare scenario. One advisor, an expert in diplomatic protocol, put it bluntly during a confidential briefing. We are no longer dealing with a personal matter. We are dealing with a structural vulnerability. And when the palace uses the word vulnerability, everyone in the room listens hard. As weeks passed, the briefings expanded. More specialists were brought in, legal experts, historians, communication strategists, security officials. And with every meeting, the tone shifted further away from hesitation and toward inevitability. Yet no one in the room dared say the outcome aloud. Not yet. Because stripping titles is a nuclear option in royal strategy. It is the last tool in a locked drawer, a drawer that usually stays sealed for decades. The palace has always preferred compromise, subtle adjustments, quiet negotiations. Using the nuclear option means admitting that compromise has failed. And that, right there, is the contradiction that made these briefings so tense. Because on paper, the Sussexes' departure from royal duties had been settled years ago. Agreements were made. Arrangements were confirmed. Statements were released. But none of those carefully crafted solutions accounted for the unprecedented world that formed afterward. A world where Harry's memoir detonated across global media, where interviews with explosive allegations became cultural events, where Meghan's public statements stirred political conversations abroad, where Netflix documentaries and podcast revelations penetrated international discourse in ways no royal had ever achieved before. The palace watched it all unfold from behind bulletproof windows, smiling politely in public while privately updating crisis briefings. And as the months passed, one question kept coming up in those confidential meetings. Has public perception reached a tipping point? At first, the answer was no. Then it became not yet. Then possibly. Then, alarmingly, we are approaching it. And then, during a private session attended by the king's senior advisors, the answer finally shifted to, we may have already passed it. That moment changed everything. Because when the palace senses that the monarchy's long-term stability could be affected, it moves. Slowly, quietly, strategically, but decisively. And so the next phase of secret briefings began. The palace began indirectly consulting with government officials. Not publicly, not formally, but through carefully structured conversations that left no fingerprints. Advisors reached out to civil servants. Civil servants communicated with department officials. Department officials flagged concerns to their superiors. By the time the issue reached cabinet office channels, it appeared not as a royal request, but as a growing national concern. This is how the palace operates when it must influence without interfering. It nudges. It signals. It raises questions instead of making suggestions. But in this case, as the weeks went on, the nudges became clearer. And that's when something unusual happened, something that set this entire crisis into motion. The Cabinet Office decided to create a preliminary document evaluating the constitutional implications of unresolved Sussex titles. That document, the same one that would later become the explosive folder delivered during the parliamentary debate, was never meant to become public. It wasn't even meant to reach MPs. It was intended strictly as an internal evaluation. But once the review began, the findings were too significant to contain. One cabinet official put it bluntly in a private briefing. We cannot continue operating in a gray zone. The titles must be clarified, one way or another. Notice the phrasing? One way or another. That is government language for, this cannot continue. And as this internal evaluation evolved, the palace watched closely. They did not intervene. They did not interfere. They simply monitored. But inside royal circles, whispers began circulating. Parliament was shifting. Government was shifting. Public patience was shifting. And when all three shift at once, the monarchy knows it must prepare for impact. Which leads us to the most important part of this chapter. The moment the palace held its own private emergency briefing, one that only a handful of senior advisors were allowed to attend. A meeting described by one insider as the most uncomfortable conversation we've had in years. It was during this meeting that the king himself was quietly briefed, not with dramatic language, not with emotional interpretation, but with facts. Cold, undeniable facts. And after listening, after absorbing the implications, after hearing the advisors present every possible alternative, the king asked a single question. A question that revealed exactly how serious the situation had become. A question that signaled the monarchy understood what was coming. A question that chilled every advisor in the room.